What's up, y'all? It's Zach with Living Corporate, and yes, you're listening to a B-side. Now, yes, we've introduced the purpose of a B-side before, but every episode, remember, guys, is someone's first episode. So for our new folks, B-sides are essentially shows we have in between our larger shows. These are much less structured and somehow even more lit, yes, even more lit than our regularly scheduled shows. Sometimes they're discussions that the hosts have internally that we share with you guys. Sometimes they are extended monologues, or maybe they're a chat with a special guest. And guess what? Today, we have such a guest, Drew MacFadyen. Drew is the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at the busiest website in human translation in the world. In addition to his professional work, Drew is passionate about anti-racism and social inequity, known in that domain as Drew and at Very White Guy. And I can confirm he's very white. He and his wife lead an organization called Interracial Jawn, where they discuss pop culture, TV, movies, and current events from their unique perspectives as a very white guy and a mostly black woman. Drew, welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
I'm well. You set the bar. That intro set it very, very high. I feel. I usually like to under-promise and over-deliver, and you set it high. But I'll try my best. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem, man. So look. Recently on the show, we've discussed the concept of allyship in corporate America.
Yep.
Were you able to check the episode out? And if so, what did you think about it?
I did listen to the last episode, and forgive me, I can't remember the author and the woman you had on as a guest.
Amy. Yeah.
So I did listen to the episode. I agree with almost everything Amy said. You know, she was pretty spot on. I thought it was a good episode. White anti-racists, myself included, have a history of being real kind of like condescending and holier than thou, in particular with other white folks, you know, like woker than you is like a, like, you know what I'm talking about? Like on Twitter, and you'll see white folks kind of like piling on to like, you know, I'm the most woke and therefore this or that. So I want to be careful. I really like what Amy had to say, and I think everything she said was really accurate. But I do struggle a little bit, and just again, you referenced the podcast that I have, and I'm married to Leslie, and she goes on Twitter as Leslie Mack, and she's an actual activist and an organizer, and has done some really amazing things. And I've seen her work, commodified, stolen, outright taken, Twitter threads turned into articles in the New York Post kind of thing. Like I actually have seen that happen. Wow. So I sometimes struggle with. I don't want to say white folk making money on anti-racism work, but there's a little bit of call it like the ally industrial complex thing where, and we white folk love education for education's sake. And I myself I'm guilty of this, right? So there's a period where I, was like, oh my gosh, and I want to learn and tell everyone else, and I want to share this thing, and I'm going to share that. And I, even on our own podcast, I've asked, whose benefit is this for? Is this really, what's it doing? But I think Amy's doing, like legitimate work within the corporate structure. But I struggle a little bit with white folk becoming experts in some regard on anti-racism, inequity, diversity, whatever you want to call it, and then profiting, call it like the Tim Wise syndrome. And that's a real privileged place for me to come from. I have as you introduced, I have a normal day job. I do well. I get paid. I provide, I'm in sales. I bring in a lot of value. And so I can say the things that I do, I don't need to make money with it, but that's certainly not the case for most folks. It's a capitalistic world. You got to make a living. But I agreed with just everything Amy said in terms of white folk having to really sort of be responsible for dismantling systems of oppression. And that maybe was the other, sometimes I struggle with the education for education's sake, because there's often that last step, how does that lead to, and I would ask Amy, and I think you asked a lot of really pointed, and I was almost like worried, just, oh my God, Zach asked like some tough questions. I hope I'm prepared. But where does the work that any of us do lead to action in terms of dismantling systems of supremacy? And that's, and I ask that myself, and I don't always have the answer. So, that might have been where I was left wanting.
No, I hear you. And I'm curious, actually, what do you think about the term ally? Like, what do you think about that term? Because I know it's a loaded word, right? And a lot of people have various feelings about it. I'm curious how you feel about that word.
I don't like it. I don't use it. I find it self-referential. If someone used it in regards to me, I'm not going to be mad about it. Mm-hmm. I understand it more as a verb as a noun, but I think a lot of people like it as a noun. And I just think the bar for what we like, and even again, I was listening to the podcast and you had Amy, and you've got me on. I'm thinking, well, why? Why? I've got a Twitter handle, very white guy. I've said a few things. I think because I'm white, people give me, my voice has a little bit more quote unquote cachet as an anti-racist individual. There's not as many white dudes being actively anti-racist, but ally to me, it's just the bar is so low. It's so low. Like my wife tells the joke, like 2 allies walked into a bar because it's just so low, and that works for any 2 male feminists walk into a bar because the bar was set so low. So I don't really like it. I don't often use it, but if someone used it, fine. I think it also to me has this sort of connotation of like finality, right? Like, oh, I'm an ally and I'm done. Like, more to than just sort of saying you're ally or one person saying you're ally. Right. It's really, what have I done? What are my actions more than what label,
No, absolutely. I'm curious, right? So we talk about, in the intro, I talked a little bit about your VP role of sales, and you've alluded to the fact that, you do well in the corporate space. I'm curious, before Interracial Jawn, which we're going to get to in a minute, can you talk to me about how you demonstrated or how you practiced anti-racist behaviors in the workplace? And I ask because when I look at your Twitter feed, very white guy, check him out, y'all, very white guy. The theme of your language is all around intentionality and action. And you really alluded to it just now when you talked about the term allyship and the concept of allyship. So I'm curious, what actions were you taking before you had the platform of Interracial Jawn to really demonstrate, and I won't say allyship, but support, for people of color?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I've always succeeded. I think as a white anti-racist individual, it's a journey from indoctrinated to doing less harm, and there's no terminal. It's not like, oh, I'm finished. I'm just trying to do less harm, and there's steps forward and steps back, and certainly there's been jobs and work and opportunities that I've missed, I'm sure. I think when I think of allyship, right, and again, I should give a lot of credence to my wife, Leslie Mack. I've been married to her for 15 years, so a lot of this maybe framing or language is coming from my learning from her direct to it. But shifting dollars and resources. I think my wife always says that marginalized folks in communities, they know what they need and they know how to solve their problems. They just need access, dollars, resources. So I try to do that, and I don't always have, I have like hiring authority at every job I've been at. I don't have the ability to say who does what, who gets on what committee, but where I do have some say. So there's an event I produce, and there's speakers, and we get folks online to watch it, and maybe thousands of people watch it. But I was really proud that we had, and in the language or translation industry, there's a lot of women, tends to be heavily represented on the women's side, and relatively on the Latinx side. But I had mostly women of color, I think 3 or 4 black women as panelists and speakers. And those are active decisions on my part. I have a platform and an ability. I want to be compensating individuals. I'd rather it be women, black women. I'm going to expose folks, thousands of folks to me watching these panelists. I don't want it to be all white men. I had another job where I did have some hiring authority, and I was proud of the fact that I hired a few black candidates that did really well and stayed on.
Yeah.
But really just shifting power and resources. That could be, you're in I heard your guest Amy, and you talking about this, that the sort of women or a black person might say something, and 5 minutes later a white person says the same thing, and it's like, oh my God, the white person's a genius. Right. Say something, stand up, support. In different places they call it, I think, progressive stack. So I've done that in meetings. Hey, who we haven't heard from her. This person hasn't spoken in a while. I had a job interview, and I think, again, I talk about action because there should be risk, and that's why I sometimes question when white folks are making money educating other white folks on how to be better. That just sort of rubs me the wrong way. But in terms of taking risks and doing things, I've had vendors and interviews where I've asked, how many how many black people do you have on staff? How diverse is your, what's your corporate culture like? And that doesn't always go well. That doesn't, I don't always have the answers I want to hear. But I would say, what have I done? I tried to just be better, tried to be a better individual and amplify and make sure marginalized folks are, I think Amy even said it, if they're not in the room, do what you can to make sure their voices are represented. Try to get them in the room, and just everywhere you can shift power and resources.
And it's funny that you say that because, even when I think about living corporate, right? So like we're a startup. When I think about when you talk about just power and resources, it's like there are a lot of things that we want to do, and there are things that we have planned in the future. And we have all these plans, and like the main barrier at this point, Drew, it's not even barrier, but the thing that would accelerate those things is just bread. Like we don't need a bunch of people telling us what to do. Of course we take, we'll take feedback and coaching and all that kind of stuff. But my point is, it's the resources. Like we need the resources. And so I think that applies to your wife Leslie's point, applies across the board. Like plenty of black folks we have, and just people of color in general, marginalized people, there's plenty of visionaries and things like that, but because of the way that things are set up structurally and have been set up historically and systemically, the resources create a barrier.
Yep.
So I'm curious, right? We talked a little bit about Interracial Jawn in your intro, but can you talk more about it, what it is, its origin, and what it aims to achieve?
Yeah, and you said you were going to ask me that, and I kind of had to think because it was sort of we've been married now for over 15 years, and we've been together quite a bit. And it's strange that our podcast is called the Interracial Jawn because I don't think we think of ourselves interracially often. Like I don't think that defines us so much. But she's a black woman and she works in liberation organizing. So I guess that is, it's a part of our existence, but I don't think we think of it very often. But when we made the podcast, at the time we lived in Philadelphia and we lived there for a decade, and Jawn is just sort of like an adjective that's used for anything and everything.
Yeah. It's made its way down to Houston too. We say it down here from time to time. I do anyway.
Sweet. I didn't know that. I guess it's like John, John, or joint. Some people would use it honestly. But so we called it Interracial Jawn, and I don't even think talk that much about us being interracial. But we talk about a lot of different politics, and we just started a podcast because we wanted to do it, and we talked a lot, and we'd sit around and just, by ourselves chit-chatting, and we said, let's record it. If somebody listens, all right, cool. And for a bit, it was really just and it still is a labor of love. You do a podcast, it's not exactly a millionaire's task.
Nice.
But we did it, and people listened and responded and subscribed, and we said, okay, we'll keep doing it. So we enjoy it, but it's really just sort of, it's more for us and just sort of time to unwind and chit chat and connect and talk about the news and stuff that's going on.
That's really cool, man. And shout out to Leslie. I think it's amazing that, at every point in turn in this conversation, you've referenced something that your wife has told you, right? So like shout out to black women in general. Sound man, go ahead and put them air horns in here just for black women. For Leslie for sure, but then black women in general. So I'm curious, what advice, right now you talked about, you said, for you, how the way that you practice, again, for lack of a better word, allyship in the corporate space is by just being better. But what advice or resources would you point white men to in corporate America to be better for everybody else?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you referenced black women, and Twitter's been a great resource. It's relatively free. Certainly be aware that you're consuming folks and try to drop a dollar on their PayPal, Cash Me, or Patreon if they have it. But yeah, there's been, I would say, just about everything I know when it comes to I was thinking, again, I said I don't like white folk being experts on race, And someone's asked me, I said, no, I'm not an expert on race. You've got the Malcolm Gladwell, is like the 10,000 hour theory. You've lived your entire life as a black individual in a white supremacist society. That's more than 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
You're well an expert. When you say, hey, that's racist, so listen and believe black folk, amplify black folk. But, I'm not an expert on that at all. The only thing I know is sort of my journey on how I've sort of learned to be less harmful, I guess.
Yeah.
This is all stuff that's on Twitter, and smarter, usually black women, like you said, have written about this. But it took me a while to just sort of learn not just what people are saying, but to process it a little bit differently. So I guess if you've been in this work at all for even a minute and you're a white dude, you've heard shut up, sit down, shut up, quiet, don't take up space. And I knew that, and enough people had said it to me that I'd go to, we lived in Philadelphia. There was a great group that's, I think, still around, Real Justice Philadelphia. But so we go to meetings, there's hundreds of people there, and of course I'm not going to say a word. I'm just sit down, I'm not going to say anything, be quiet. And I've been to many of these meetings, and I understand fundamentally to be quiet and not take up space. But my mind would keep kind of rolling. It'd be thinking, oh, what about this? What about that? What about this? And there might have been, I can't remember the exact instance, but there was finally something where, again, my wife was like, made fun of me, like, okay, very white guy, like, they don't need your help, good for you. And it was like all, joking and sarcastic, but I was like, oh my God, like, she's really right. So the concept of sit down, be quiet, don't take up space, I understood it differently over a period of time. My different understanding was, I'm a neophyte. I don't really know anything. I need to really just sit down and absorb and really process. And if I'm thinking of things, and that's again, as a white dude, the world has told me as a white man, my opinion is valued, it's needed, it's necessary, my 2 cents are desired, and I can solve it. And you asked about, allyship, corporate world, so on and so on. I remember, not like embarrassed, but I've been in a room full of people. I've pounded my fist on a desk and raised my voice and gotten what I wanted and things done. And that modality is it's like a sock that you've worn your whole life, a glove that fits seamlessly. It's real easy. So to not be a cisgendered heterosexual white male that raises his voice and reverts to angry white dude to get what he wants, that takes vigilance. It's kind of like actively not trying to be a horrible person. You slip into it so easily. So I would say, as a white man, just be aware, understand conditioned fragility and defensiveness. I think it's a lot easier. Understand how to apologize, know that you're going to mess up, and be prepared. I've messed up plenty. I'm trying, don't mess up. Don't go out trying to spin it. But like, many people are willing to forgive and stay in community with me after a mistake, but very few would be willing to remain in community if I made a mistake and then spend an hour being defensive and fragile about it. Right. Like, I didn't mean it that way. I'm so sorry. I wasn't trying to be racist. So like, I would just say to other, especially white dudes, we're going to mess up. The world's catered to us for a long time. So sit down, listen, be quiet. And when you mess up, acknowledge it, accept it, know how to apologize. I'm sorry, I'll do better. And that goes a long way. Those 3 little things will get you really far.
Man, you ain't lying, because I have some white male friends, and when they practice those things, they just apologize, and we're friends. Like they're some of my closest friends, right? And because they practice those behaviors that you're talking about, we continue to be friends, and our relationship gets better after every mess up. And I'm there with you. I'm curious, before we wrap, do you have any shout outs or any parting words? This has been a dope conversation. I want to make sure, anything else you'd like to say or anybody you'd like to thank or just shout out in general, man.
Thank you for this opportunity and having me on the show. I appreciate it. As I said, the real deal in the household is my wife, Leslie Mack, and she's on Twitter. You can follow her at Leslie Mack. She's got a Patreon, so you can support her that way. And we've got a podcast, Interracial Jawn, and that's JAWN. We don't tweet much, but would love to have you listen to the show and follow us. But to your last point, my little follow up to your comment. I have individuals in my life that I'm accountable to, both white and black. And when I mess up and they say, hey, you know what, this came off wrong, or I think this was framed a certain way, man, that's like a gift. Not only have I learned not to get fragile and defensive about it, but I have to think like, wow, they care enough about me as a person that they're going to A, let me know, and B, give me an opportunity to do better, right? Like, if I really don't like you and you mess up, I'm like, get out of here, whatever. But if I'm in a relationship with, like, hey, you know what you did, let me pull you aside and really kind of. So if you win, when you get called out, whichever it is, accept it as a gift, because it really is. Honest to goodness, it really truly is. It's a gift to be able to learn how to be a better person, and not enough people are willing to receive that gift in the proper way. So be better, white dudes, me included.
Man, this has been awesome. Look, that does it for us, guys. Thank you for joining us on the Living Corporate podcast. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Living Corporate, Twitter at LivingCorp_pod, and subscribe to our newsletter through www.living-corporate.com. Check us out on Patreon at Living Corporate. If you have a question you'd like for us to answer and read on the show, make sure you email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. This has been Zach, and you've been talking to Drew, aka @VeryWhiteGuy. Peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin from Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.